It was a Tuesday, just after 6 in the morning, and I was loading my truck for another 2-week job site rotation when my neighbor stopped me cold. He's a retired postal worker, 63 years old, the kind of man who notices everything but says nothing unless it truly matters. He's lived 3 houses down from us for 9 years. We wave, we talk about football. He's never once knocked on my door uninvited. So, when I saw him crossing the street in his bathrobe, moving faster than I'd ever seen him move, I knew before he opened his mouth that something was wrong. He looked past me at the house, then back at me, and lowered his voice like the neighborhood itself might hear him. He told me he didn't know how to say it, so he was just going to say it. He said that every time I left for a work trip, a truck showed up in my driveway that same night. Always after 10. Always gone before sunrise. He said it had been happening for at least 4 months. He said he recognized the truck. He'd seen it before, parked in front of my house on holidays, on my birthday last spring, at the barbecue I threw the summer before. He said it was my brother's truck. I didn't speak. I just stood there with my duffel bag in my hand and my keys in my other hand, and felt the whole world tilt about 3 degrees to the left. I asked him if he was certain. He said he wrote down the plate number the second time it happened because something felt wrong. He pulled a folded gas station receipt out of his bathrobe pocket and held it out to me. I recognized the last 4 digits without even needing to check. I'd helped my brother pick out that truck. I'd co-signed the loan when his credit wasn't strong enough to qualify a loan. I thanked him. I told him I appreciated it more than he knew. I shook his hand and held it for a second longer than normal, the way you hold onto something steady when the ground is moving under you. Then I walked back inside, set my bag down in the hallway, and stood in the kitchen for a long time without doing anything at all. My wife was still upstairs. I could hear the shower running. I thought about going up there. I thought about standing in the bathroom doorway and asking her directly. I thought about calling my brother right then, watching his name light up on my phone, hearing him answer the way he always answered, relaxed and easy like nothing in the world was ever his fault. I didn't do any of it. I made coffee instead. I sat at the kitchen table and I thought, clearly and carefully, the way I think through load-bearing calculations on a job site. No emotion, just structure. What do I know? What do I need to know? What do I do with it once I have it? By the time my wife came downstairs, I was rinsing my mug in the sink with my back to her. She kissed me on the cheek and asked if I was running late. I said I had a few minutes. She poured herself coffee and scrolled through her phone, and the two of us stood in that kitchen like everything was completely normal. And I realized in that moment that she had done this many, many times. That this version of normal was something she had practiced. I drove to the job site. I spent the entire 4-hour drive thinking about my brother. We grew up sharing a bedroom until I was 15. I taught him how to drive in an empty parking lot when he was 14 because our father worked nights and wasn't around. When he got fired from his job 3 years ago, he slept on our couch for 6 weeks. My wife cooked for him. I lent him money I never asked back for. I stood beside him at a funeral 2 years ago and held him together when he thought he was going to fall apart. I thought I knew every version of him that existed. I checked into my motel, sat on the edge of the bed, and opened my laptop. I had a contact through work, a guy who handled security installations for commercial properties. I'd sent him business his way more than once. I texted him that night and told him I needed 3 indoor cameras. Residential, discreet, nothing visible to someone who wasn't looking for them. He asked no questions. He said he could have them shipped to a P.O. box by Thursday. I told my project manager I needed to handle something personal and drove back home on Friday morning while my wife thought I was 4 hours away reviewing structural assessments. I had 2 hours alone in the house. I installed 1 camera in the living room, positioned inside a bookshelf between 2 thick hardcover books we hadn't opened in years. 1 in the kitchen, angled from above the refrigerator behind a hanging basket she kept dried flowers in. 1 in the entryway, tucked inside the frame of a decorative mirror she picked out herself at an antique market on our 3rd anniversary. I drove back to the job site. I opened the monitoring app on my phone. All 3 feeds were clear. I waited. Friday night, nothing. Saturday night, nothing. She called me around 9 to ask what time I'd be home Sunday. I told her probably late afternoon. She said she'd make dinner. I said that sounded good. She said she loved me. I said it back, and the words came out completely flat, like I was reading a line from a document. Sunday at 10:18 p.m. Headlights swept across the entryway camera. I was lying in the motel bed, fully dressed, laptop open on my chest, and I watched my brother's truck pull into my driveway. I watched my wife open the front door before he even knocked. She was wearing a dress I had never seen before. She had the kind of smile on her face that I hadn't seen her give me in longer than I wanted to calculate right then. He walked in like he lived there. Not nervous, not cautious. Comfortable. The way you move through a space you've moved through dozens of times. He dropped his keys on the entryway table, the same table where I drop my keys every single day, and she leaned up and kissed him, and I watched it happen on a 3-inch laptop screen from a motel room 200 miles away. I closed the laptop. I sat in the dark for a while. There's a specific kind of pain that doesn't feel like pain right away. It feels like a door closing. Like air leaving a room very slowly. I wasn't angry yet. I was just recalibrating. Updating my understanding of the last 4 months, the last year, maybe longer, based on new information that changed the meaning of almost everything. I thought about the last time my brother and I had a real conversation. He'd called me late on a Wednesday to tell me about a woman he was seeing, someone he said made him feel different than anyone had before. He didn't say her name. He said he wasn't ready to introduce her yet. He said he wanted to wait until he was sure it was going somewhere. I had told him that sounded serious. I had told him I was happy for him. I opened the laptop back up. I watched the rest of the footage for exactly as long as I needed to. Enough to document. Enough to timestamp. Enough so that there was no version of this conversation later where anyone could say I misunderstood or overreacted or didn't have proof. Then I opened a new email draft, added my attorney's address in the to field, wrote the subject line as when I say send, and left it sitting there. I went to sleep at 2 a.m. And I slept better than I had in months. Monday morning, I was back on the job site by 8. I worked a full day. I talked to my crew, reviewed drawings, answered calls. My brother texted me around noon asking if I was free Thursday to grab lunch. I said probably. I'd let him know. That evening, I called my attorney from the truck. She's someone I've worked with on contract disputes, sharp and thorough, no nonsense in a way I've always respected. I told her the situation in about 4 minutes. I told her I had video evidence and I was not interested in a long drawn-out process. I told her I wanted to know exactly what I was entitled to, what I needed to do to protect myself financially before I made any move, and what the cleanest path to an exit looked like. She asked me one question. She asked if I was sure. I told her I had watched it myself on 3 cameras from 200 miles away. She said she'd have paperwork ready by Wednesday. Tuesday morning, I quietly transferred a specific amount from our joint account into a personal account I had opened 2 weeks earlier at a different bank. Not all of it. Just my half. Just what I'd contributed. I had the statements pulled and categorized. I knew the numbers down to the last paycheck. Wednesday I met with my attorney. I signed what needed to be signed. I reviewed what needed to be reviewed. She looked at the footage I'd brought on a thumb drive and didn't flinch, just nodded slowly and said this would make things very straightforward. That evening I started making changes. Not dramatic ones. Quiet ones. I removed her name from my health insurance beneficiary and updated it to my mother. I logged into the streaming accounts she used on the TV in our bedroom and changed the passwords. Small things. Individually meaningless. Together, a pattern she would start noticing soon. She called Thursday afternoon. Her voice had a careful quality to it, the way someone sounds when they're trying to seem casual and working too hard at it. She asked if the card was having issues because something had declined at the grocery store. I told her the bank had flagged some unusual activity and was reviewing the account, that it should clear up soon. She said okay. She said it in the voice of someone who is beginning to sense something but hasn't decided yet whether to push. I drove home Thursday night. She was on the couch when I came through the door, and for a moment she looked genuinely glad to see me. I wondered which version of glad it was. I wondered how long she had been practicing that particular expression. I sat across from her. Not beside her. Across from her, we talked for about an hour. Surface-level things. Her sister's new apartment, a problem with the gutters, whether we wanted to do anything for the holidays this year. Normal conversation. She made it look easy and I matched her. And the whole time I was thinking about a Sunday night at 10:18 and a dress I had never seen and the way my brother dropped his keys on my table like it was his own house. When she went to bed, I went to my home office, pulled up the camera footage from the past 3 weeks, and exported everything to an encrypted drive. Then I did something I hadn't planned but felt completely right. I called my neighbor. It was late, but he answered on the second ring. I told him I wanted him to know that I had handled things. I told him that what he did took real character and that it wasn't something I would forget. He was quiet for a second and then he said he had been watching my house out of his window for 4 months trying to work up the nerve to say something, and that every morning he'd seen me back out of that driveway and leave, it had sat on him like a stone. He said he was sorry he hadn't said something sooner. I told him there was nothing to apologize for. I told him I owed him a proper dinner sometime soon, whatever he wanted, his choice. He laughed a little and said he'd hold me to that. Friday night, my wife went out. She said she was having dinner with a friend from her yoga class. I said that sounded nice. She kissed me on the cheek on her way out the door, and I watched her headlights disappear down the street. I sent a text to my brother. I said I was home for the weekend and asked if he wanted to come by Saturday, hang out, watch whatever game was on. He replied fast. He said, absolutely, he'd be there by noon. He showed up at 12:06 with a six-pack and a smile, and he walked into my house and clapped me on the shoulder the way he always did, and I felt something that wasn't quite anger and wasn't quite grief. It was more like the feeling of standing at a demolition site right before they push the button. Everything still standing, everything already over. We sat in the living room. We talked about the job site, about our mother's birthday coming up, about a buddy of ours from high school who'd just gotten engaged. He was relaxed. He was funny. He was exactly who he had always been to me, and I kept thinking about that. Kept sitting with the particular weight of it, because the worst part wasn't the betrayal. The worst part was how easy he made it look. Around 2 o'clock, my wife came home. She didn't know he was there. I hadn't mentioned it to her. When she walked through the front door and saw him sitting in the living room, she stopped so fast she was almost stumbling. I watched it happen. The color in her face changed. Her eyes went to me, then to him, then back to me. My brother's jaw tightened. He set his beer down on the table very slowly. I stood up and walked to the media cabinet. I said I wanted to show them something. I said I'd been doing a security upgrade on the house, which was true, and that I'd been testing out the camera placement, which was also true. I said the footage quality had turned out really well, better than I expected. I picked up the remote and turned on the TV. The room went completely quiet. The footage was time-stamped in the bottom right corner. The image was clear. The living room, the one we were all sitting in right now. A Sunday night. After 10, my wife in the dress I had never seen before. My brother, comfortable, at home, in my house, with my wife, in a way that required no interpretation. My brother stood up. He started to say something about how this wasn't what it looked like, and I held up one hand and he stopped. I told him that I had 3 cameras and 4 months of footage and an attorney who had already reviewed all of it, and that the time for explanations had passed somewhere around month 2 of a pattern that he thought I'd never find out about. I told him that I wasn't going to shout. I wasn't going to make a scene. I told him that I had already made every decision I needed to make, and that all of this was simply a formality. He looked at me, the way he used to look at me when we were kids, and he knew he'd broken something and was trying to figure out whether to admit it or run. He tried once more. He said my name. He said, listen. I told him I already listened. For 4 months I had essentially been listening, just not the way he thought. I told him the front door was behind him and that I expected we would not be speaking for a long time, possibly ever. And that I wanted him to think about that on the drive home. He left without another word. The door didn't slam. That almost made it worse. My wife hadn't moved from the entryway. She was still standing there with her keys in her hand, and when I turned to face her, I could see that she had already accepted what was happening. She wasn't going to fight it. Some part of her had probably been waiting for this. The way you wait for weather you can see building on the horizon. She asked me how long I'd known. I said long enough. She said she was sorry. I believed her. I believed she was sorry. I just didn't think sorry was a currency that bought back anything worth having. Trust. Once you understand clearly and fully what it looks like when someone removes it from you with intention and practice, doesn't get rebuilt by an apology. It gets rebuilt, maybe, by years of something different. And I wasn't interested in years of something different with her. I was interested in walking into the next part of my life without carrying this one on my back. I walked to the kitchen counter and picked up a manila envelope and carried it back to where she was standing. I held it out to her. She looked at it for a moment without taking it. Then she opened it and I watched her read the first page and I watched her face go through several things in about 4 seconds. She said she didn't want this. I said, I know. She said we could go to counseling, we could talk to someone, we could work through it. I said I thought she had made a specific choice, repeatedly, over a significant period of time, and that choice told me everything I needed to know about what she actually wanted, and that it wasn't counseling. She reached out and touched my arm and I stepped back, not sharply, not with anger, just back, creating exactly the amount of distance I needed. I told her I had already called a moving company and that they could be here Saturday morning. I told her she could take everything that was hers, that I wasn't going to fight about objects, and that my attorney would be in touch with hers about the rest of the process. I told her I expected it to be simple and fast because I had made sure it would be. She cried. I don't say that to be cruel about it. I say it because it happened and because I stood there and watched it and felt something that was close to sadness but not quite sadness. More like standing in a place you used to love and realizing you don't recognize it anymore. She asked where she was supposed to go. I thought for a moment about all the Sunday nights and all the things I hadn't known, and I said I imagined she could figure that out. She gathered a few things from upstairs. She was quiet about it. When she came back down, she stood in the entryway for a moment and looked at the house, the couch, the walls, the kitchen where she'd made coffee every morning for the last 4 years, and I could see her memorizing it or maybe saying goodbye to it or maybe just understanding for the first time the actual weight of the choices she'd made. She walked out. I locked the door behind her. I stood alone in my living room for a long time. The house was very quiet. Not the bad kind of quiet, the kind that sits heavy with absence and accusation. More like the kind of quiet you notice after a long, sustained noise finally stops. Clean, neutral, open. I went to the kitchen and poured myself a glass of water and stood at the counter drinking it and thought about the next week and the week after that. I thought about calling my mother, who was going to take this hard. I thought about the guys on my crew who would notice I wasn't wearing my ring anymore and wouldn't say anything, which I appreciated already in advance. I thought about my neighbor, across the street and down 3 houses, who had stood in his bathrobe on a weekday morning and done the hardest and most decent thing that anyone had done for me in years. I thought about my brother. I thought about him for a long time. Longer than I thought about my wife, if I'm honest. Because with my wife there was grief, real grief, the kind that comes from losing a version of your life you believed in. But with my brother there was something older and heavier underneath it. We had a history that predated her. We had a language between us that had taken 30 years to build. And he had decided, somewhere along the line, that none of that was as important as what he wanted. He had sat across from me at holiday dinners and birthday lunches and poker nights and looked me in the eye and said my name like he meant it while doing the thing he was doing. I decided that night not to call him. Not that week, not that month. I decided that whatever grief I felt about losing my brother, I would allow myself to feel in private, quietly, over time, without giving him a front row seat to it. He didn't deserve to watch me process what he had cost me. He didn't deserve the catharsis of my anger or the apparent sincerity of my pain. He would get nothing from me. Not a word, not a text, not even the satisfaction of knowing how much it had landed. Sometimes, the most complete thing you can say to someone is nothing. The moving company came the following Saturday. My wife was there with a friend to help her sort through things. I stayed out of their way. I organized my garage. I cleaned out the refrigerator. By 4 in the afternoon they were gone and the house was quieter than it had been in years, lighter somehow. Like a room after you move furniture you didn't realize had been blocking the window. 3 weeks later, I was back on a job site 3 states away, and at 6 in the morning, I was loading my truck and I thought about the morning my neighbor stopped me and I thought about how differently I had loaded that same truck on that same kind of morning, not long ago. Same truck. Same duffel bag. Same coffee cooling in the cup holder. Different man. My attorney called at 8 to tell me the paperwork had been filed and that she expected minimal resistance given the documentation and that I should plan for finalization within 60 days. I thanked her and asked how much I owed her for this last round of work and she gave me a number and I said I'd send a check that afternoon. I called my mother that evening. It was a hard conversation. She cried. She asked me about my brother and I told her I wasn't ready to talk about that part yet. And she understood, or at least she agreed not to push it. She told me she loved me and I told her the same and the call ended and I sat in the truck in the parking lot of the motel and watched the sun go all the way down. The job site was a 16-story mixed-use building going up on the edge of a city I'd never spent real time in before. Big project, complex, interesting work. The kind of thing that requires your full attention, and I was grateful for that. I threw myself into it. Early mornings, late evenings, problem-solving the kind of structural puzzles that leave no room in your head for anything else. My crew was good. The project manager was someone I'd worked with before and trusted. The days were long, and the work was real and there is a specific relief in having something in front of you that demands everything you have. 61 days after my attorney filed, I signed the final documents. I sat at her conference table with a pen in my hand and signed my name across the bottom of the last page and she slid it into a folder and told me it was done. I shook her hand and walked out into a bright afternoon and stood on the sidewalk for a moment with no particular plan. I thought about calling someone. I couldn't think of who to call that I wanted to talk to right then. I thought about my neighbor, the one who had crossed the street in his bathrobe to do the right thing, and I texted him that the whole thing was finalized and that I hadn't forgotten about that dinner. He replied in about 30 seconds with a thumbs up and then, after a pause, a second text that just said, "Good man." I put my phone in my pocket and walked to my truck. My name is Marcus. I'm 31 years old. I spent 4 years building a life I believed in with a woman I trusted and a brother I would have done anything for. I spent 60 days dismantling the parts of that life that were built on a foundation I hadn't known was compromised. And I spent the rest of the time, The time after the last signature and the last text and the last conversation, understanding something that takes a while to fully sit with. That what happened to me wasn't a failure. It wasn't a reflection of what I was worth or what I deserved or what I had done wrong. It was a series of choices that other people made, for reasons that are theirs to carry, not mine. I had done the thing that was hardest to do, which was to find out the truth when I could have chosen not to look for it, and then to act on it clearly and without losing myself in the process. I didn't break anything I was proud of. I walked away from the things that had already been broken. That's the only way I know how to say it. I drove back to the job site. There was a foundation inspection at 7 the next morning and I needed to review the drawings before then. The work was waiting. The city was still being built. I had a role in it and I intended to do it well. I turned on the radio and drove, and somewhere outside the city, with the highway wide and open ahead of me, I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time. Just forward. Just clear. Just mine.